Hi, welcome to the second video in my new Reflections of an Unapologetic Christian YouTube channel. And in this first one, I'd like to, the first one after the introduction, I'd like to talk a little bit or reflect a little bit on the story of Abraham and his offer of sacrifice of his son. Commanded by God. Okay, so the standard telling of this story is fairly straightforward. God commands Abraham to offer up his son as a sacrifice. Abraham is obedient, he doesn't question God. He takes his son out into the country and prepares to sacrifice him, at which point God relents and presents him with a ram that's tangled up in the nearby bushes as a substitute for his son. So Abraham offers up the ram in the place of his son, and God is very pleased with Abraham because of Abraham's obedience and his willingness to offer up his son. All of this takes place on the holy Mount Moriah, and afterwards Abraham wins the favour of God because of this obedience, this unquestioning obedience. And then two things happen. One is that God blesses Abraham and makes him the patriarch of a enormous and important family, ultimately in the biblical story of the 12 tribes of Israel are his progeny. And David, Solomon, and so on are his heir, his descendants. The other thing that God does is that after this willingness to offer up his son in sacrifice, Abraham he encounters the king of Salem, and who is a high priest of Melchizedek. Now, this is an interesting thing. We don't know a great deal about who Melchizedek is, or what being a high priest of Melchizedek is really about, but it has a great deal of significance for Christianity, as something that we will get to in due course, because the next high priest of Melchizedek that we encounter in the Christian Bible is none other than Jesus himself. So this Melchizedekian priesthood, this is an important concept. And I think it's far more important than a lot of people realise. There are a couple of things worth noting. That a high priest of Melchizedek, as far as we can work out, serves God known as either El Shaddai or El Elyon. So this is God, the Most High God, or the God of righteousness. And it's only later when Moses encounters God in the burning bush that he is told that the name of God is in fact, it's a different form, I am that I am. It becomes seen as Jehovah, or Yod He Vav He. Now, this name change is meant to be the revelation of God's true name, and it's not that on the sort of superficial biblical narrative. It's not that Abraham worships El Shaddai or El Elyon, and Moses worships Jehovah, and they're different gods. The general assumption is that Abraham didn't know the true name or the secret name of God that was communicated to Moses. But as we'll see, there are reasons for thinking that that's rather different, that the name Jehovah is associated with the Levitic priesthood, which is distinct from the Melchizedekian priesthood, and that in fact Jesus' father is not Jehovah. He gives a strong indication that that might be the case in his interactions with the Pharisees, the Levite priesthood, when he repeatedly states that they don't actually know his father, rather implying that the God that they worship or that they know is not his father, is a different one. So that's something that we'll be looking at. But I think that the story of Abraham is a good place to start. So what does science and scholarship tell us about it? Well, it doesn't tell us a great deal, because this is an ancient story. It's an ancient story when the Bible is beginning to be collated together, about 700 BC. Scholars disagree about when exactly this happened, but it's somewhere around then, give or take a few hundred years, well after the time of the first temple, right, around the time of the end of the Babylonian exile and the return and the founding of the second temple. But the stories go back. These are ancient stories. Scholarship can tell us a bit about them. We can be reasonably confident that the versions that we have are retellings of earlier stories. These are stories that are set in a more remote epoch, because, of course, Abraham is in the biblical narrative, comes after the flood, after Noah, after the story of Noah, but before Moses. In fact, it's before really the Egyptian captivity in the biblical narrative, right? So we're talking about something like 4,000 years ago, give or take, half a millennia. These are ancient stories. The datings get very unreliable as we go back in time. Scholarship and archaeology tell us, I'm going to make some very sweeping statements and not go through it. This is not intended to be a work of biblical scholarship. This is a reflection in the light of the work of scholars and things, but this isn't supposed to be some kind of scholarly treatise, But one of the things that they tell us is that as we go back in time beyond about 700 BC, the further back we go, the more historically inaccurate and unreliable the Bible gets as a narrative, which is not surprising, because these are now stories that have been handed down over generations, and we know they've been changed. We know they've been reworked to serve the interests of the scribes who've recorded them and people who've retold the stories, in some cases, for example, with the story of Noah, because we actually have early tellings of the stories, and they are, in many senses, radically different to the ones that get included in the Bible. Other things that tell scholars that this kind of things happened are the place names, that a lot of the place names used in telling the early stories of people like Abraham, Noah, the place names that gets used in the telling of these stories are not the ancient place names. They're place names that were current around 700 BC, or whenever they were written. As I say, I'm not being historically hugely precise here because it doesn't really matter from our point of view. It doesn't matter when exactly it was written down. It doesn't matter when exactly and by whom these stories were reworked. Scholars agree that they are, even though they disagree about exactly when and where this happened. It was well after the point at which the stories are set. Archaeologists can't tell us anything really about the story of Abraham because we don't know where and when it took place. In fact, the story that we have, scholars think, may well be put together from two quite distinct traditions, reflecting two of the peoples or cultures that came together to create Judaism as we know it, contributing different stories that get worked together to one to kind of bring the people together under a common kind of narrative. We can also say something about when this was put together. If this was indeed put together at the beginning of at the time of the construction of the second temple, where we know there's a story about them rediscovering earlier scriptures in the ruins of the temple, but perhaps they weren't rediscovered. Perhaps that's actually when they were put together and written, and for a purpose, at a time when the Levitican priesthood were trying to re-establish the power of and authority of the temple and of the Jewish kings of the time. So they are very much reworked in a way that makes obedience to authority, the authority of the priesthood and the temple, as a central theme. But there are some other things, I think, that archaeology can tell us about the time. So if something really happened, right, if there was a man, Abraham, maybe with a slightly different, maybe the name got changed over time, maybe the story gets retold, but maybe there's a core of truth behind it. Maybe there was a man who at one point in ancient history was required by God, and I'm going to put inverted commas around that, okay, as standing for something, but we'll get into that in a minute, was required by God to offer up his son as a human sacrifice, and who did indeed find a ram entangled in a bush, and instead of sacrificing his son, treated finding that ram as a message from God that it was okay, he could substitute the ram and he could offer that up instead and preserve his son's life and start a new relationship with God, one in which you were no longer required to offer up human beings in sacrifice, right? Maybe there was such a man. Maybe this marks a change in a culture. Either way, one can see that one can see why this story would prove powerful, especially if you look at the archaeological evidence from back in what may well have been the Bronze Age, maybe early Iron Age. Since we don't know exactly when and where it came from, it's very difficult to say exactly what was going on at the time. But there's one thing that archaeology is showing us with increasing clarity. It's that in the past, in the remote past, humanity went through a period when there was enormous violence. there's been some work done recently on the sort of variation in DNA in samples from modern people going back into the past, looking particularly at the DNA in male lineages, and there is now enormous evidence that at various points in our past, it's slightly different things. The amount of genetic variation goes down enormously in the male population, suggesting a contraction in the male population, that there was a kind of bottleneck at a certain point. This bottleneck happens over thousands or more years, and it happens in different places. And what it points to is a massive contraction of the male population. Right down, about 90% of the male population was literally decimated, right? Beyond decimation, 1 in 10 was a Roman punishment that made them, a disobedient unit had to kill 1 in 10 of their members, right? But no, this was 90%, this would be 9 out of 10. And there's a lot of debate about the causes, but it seems to have been, if not completely caused by, definitely connected with extreme levels of violence, in which males just fought males and just killed each other off. Sacrifice, human sacrifice, seems to have been very common. We know it was amongst the Aztecs, but there's evidence of sacrifice of children or killing of children. Killing and sacrifice, it's not always very clear whether a killing is a ritual sacrifice or more a sort of a punishment and execution. Quite often these overlap in ancient, the way they would be understood. An execution could also be seen as a sacrifice. And this sheds, I think, an important light on the story, because the way the story has been handed down to us through these priests who were very concerned about establishing the authority of their own priesthood. This is a story about authority. It is obedience to God, unquestioning obedience to God, even in doing something absolutely appalling, is what was the act of faith by Abraham that God responded to, that made God, made God bless him with his children miraculously. Sarah giving birth when she's extremely old as a miraculous intervention by God, a reward to Abraham for his faithfulness and his willingness to slaughter his son. And of course, Abraham encountering the king of Salem and the high priest of Melchizedek. And being blessed by him. Of course, as well as the Melchizedek, we have this theme of the sacrifice of the son. There's a deep connection between the story of Abraham and Jesus. Right, but again, this is something we'll dwell on a bit later. But my point at the moment is, you see, what archaeology is telling us, and to a certain extent history, is that the willingness to sacrifice your child at this time in history was not unusual. This would not have made this a standout story. The more unusual thing about it would be that Abraham didn't go through with it. Right? Now, today, that wouldn't be so obvious, since we think of sacrificing of children as being an appalling act, right? Something that's not a commonplace thing at all, right? There's some extent in which that's not necessarily true. Some people would say, well, think about parents sending their children off to be killed in wars. we're not totally immune to the idea of sacrifice, but to actually offer up your child to God by slitting their throat on an altar is something that we would consider appalling and that would be really standout. But actually, people did that. This was relatively normal behaviour back then. It varied, obviously. We don't know exactly where back there is, but really, we do know that the god El, who was the highest god of the Canaanite pantheon, sort of back in Sumeria, and that fed into the Jewish conception of Jehovah eventually. Back probably about the time that the story of Abraham really would come from, El would have been the highest god in the Canaanite pantheon, and Jehovah was actually a subordinate. Jehovah had a wife, Asherah, and Jehovah was subordinate to El, who was the Most High God, and Jehovah was a relatively lowly regional god. We'll talk about what he was later on in other videos. But El required human sacrifice. It was not. Human sacrifice took place in Canaan. We're told that, later on the Jews distinguished themselves from other Canaanites very sharply. So they'll say, that Baal required human sacrifice and things, but Jehovah never did. Well, we'll talk about that later. Jehovah is not exactly the most loving and kind and forgiving of gods. He slaughters people quite regularly, but including some of the children of Israel. But certainly human sacrifice was quite common at the time. So it would not be stand out that Abraham was willing to offer up his son in sacrifice. Other kinds of things that we can get, partly from kind of scholarship, archaeology, anthropology, and also from the Bible itself, is there's a rather glib thing in this story, right? God commands Abraham to kill his son. Now, if I was to walk up to you in the pub and say, I'm thinking of sacrificing my son because God told me to do it, I think the first thing you'd probably say, well, after sort of what, would be, well, what makes you think God's telling you to do that? I mean, how did God tell you to do that? But because we've got this idea that the Bible is a kind of reliable record of what happened, particularly of God's actions in the world, people are generally inclined to just go, yeah, okay, so God asked Abraham, it's all right, he told him, well, God tells people to do things in the Bible. But I think it's important to say, well, how? How did God require command Abraham to kill his son? And we do have some indications in the Bible at different points in the biblical narrative, right? We have accounts that tell us how exactly, or give us some indication of how God is supposed to have spoken to people, right? And there are various means by which God does so, right? So early on in Genesis, God has a physical body. God has a physical presence. God turns up and talks, like a man. We're not given an exact physical description of him, but he comes into the garden, he walks into the garden. We're told man was created in his own image. So the obvious interpretation is that God actually comes along with 4 legs, 2 arms, eyes, face, mouth, hair, and he talks to Adam and Eve and tells them, don't eat the fruit. And when he's not there, he can't see what's happening. He is very much like a sort of incredibly powerful, supernaturally powerful, but still essentially human ruler who, can command angels and things. But When he wasn't in the garden, he couldn't see the serpent, who's a physical creature with legs initially. He couldn't see the serpent tempting Adam and Eve, right? And he speaks through his mouth and commands them. Later on, God doesn't come in person in that way and isn't subject to the same limitations. Now he can see things when he's not physically present. Maybe isn't a physical entity at all later on. So how does this non-physical being communicate with people? Sometimes through angels. And there's the sort of angels of Enoch, of the Enochian and Ezekiel, these kind of weird winged creatures with multiple eyes and things. But actually through most of the Bible, angels are actually just messengers of God, and quite often they're people. Or they like people, they look like people, they sit there and they tell people, they give people messages. That's one way. Another way that God communicates is through dreams. He tells people things in dreams and they wake up and remember them. A third way, now this is one that a lot of modern Christians and Jews like to forget about, is through the ephod. The ephod was a garment worn by by the priests, the high priest, that had things hanging from it, and it seems that these jewels hanging and things hanging from the front of the ephod were used for some kind of divination. Possibly done connected with the Ark of the Covenant. And sometimes that, of course, that brings us then, God speaks out of a burning bush, which is an interesting one that we will look at in some depth in another video. But so those are some of the ways that God communicates with people. But another way that I think he communicates, or is seen as communicating by the people who wrote the stories in the Bible, is that God is sometimes prophets. I've missed prophets. God also speaks through the mouths of prophets. He inspires prophets and sends messages through prophets. So at the time of, but there's a third way, and that is he speaks through the scriptures. And before the scriptures are written down, you could say that he also speaks through the traditions of the culture. Right? They have the law. They have their versions of what's required of them from their religion, and this is seen as, interpreted, presented as God speaking or God commanding. God commands you to do this. God commanded. So, given that there's no account in the story of meeting an angel or some voice coming from a burning bush or something, it seems to me that the most plausible interpretation of God commanding Abraham to offer up his son in sacrifice is that this was a requirement of the culture in which Abraham was embedded, that his religion, his religious practices required his son, that he sacrifice his son. And this is being presented as God commanding, right? But this is how the command takes place. And this is, neither archaeology nor scholarship can ever say this is what happened. And I can't say that I know what happened because I'm not privy to what actually happened. I can't look at the real events. But this is certainly a plausible interpretation of it that is consistent with what we know of the time. Religion did indeed quite often, the religions in operation in that area did often require human sacrifice, including offering up your children. And this does seem to be the most likely way that God was commanding Abraham to do it. Now, if that's the case, and if that's if that's a widespread practice at the time of Abraham, which seems entirely probable, then there's no reason why this story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son should stand out and become something that speaks to people so much that it gets handed on for maybe 4,000 years and still lives today and influences how we think, act, and do. So I think that the important thing about the story of Abraham is not his willingness to offer up his son when commanded to by God, is that when required to do that, by the command of God that I see as being most probably mediated or delivered through the religious practices of his people at the time, Abraham sees a ram tangled in a bush and chooses, and this is important, he chooses to interpret that as God giving him a sign that he can substitute the ram for his son. I don't believe that the important thing about this story is his obedience. It's actually his disobedience, that he disobeys the traditions of his people. And he seizes finding this entangled ram as an opportunity, and he chooses to interpret that as God, as a sign from God that it is okay to substitute the ram instead. And so we get the start of the Abrahamic tradition of offering up animals, particularly a ram or sheep or a goat, as sacrifices, and abandoning human sacrifice. That to me is the important thing about Abraham. And when you really understand, when you really think about how God commanded him and how God then told him it was okay by him choosing to interpret this ram in that way, I think this is the real power of the story. This is really why the story is so important. It is a message of freedom. It's a message of the possibility of progressing. And the thing that makes it so important is that Abraham's choice of interpreting this ram as a sign is then confirmed by God. And obviously we're going to have to talk, people say, do you believe in God? And the question that always comes to me is, well, I don't know, what do you mean by God? And that's a difficult one, right? But we'll use God for now, right? And later we'll use God. I'm not actually arguing for atheism or something here, but anyway, to choose to interpret this as a sign from God, and then subsequently this is confirmed by God through the king of Salem blessing him, the high priest of Melchizedek blessing him, and through the blessing of Sarah, and not just Sarah. This is a story that we'll look at in quite considerable detail as well later. Okay. So the Levitican priesthood later on try to get us to see this, to see the point of this story as being blind obedience, unquestioning blind obedience. But I don't think it's a story about that at all. It's a story about human spirit, about the triumph of love over tradition, love over a culture that is riven by violence and by exploitation and using people, sacrificing people, and a refusal to go along with the oppressive ways of the past, a refusal to be blindly obedient to tradition. Of course, this story is loved by conservative clergy who want us to see them as, God's commandment incarnate on earth, and to be obedient to God. And of course, that means also obedient to them. That's not what Abraham is really about. I don't think that's why that story has lasted 4,000 years. I don't think it's real message, but it's a message that has got lost, just as the Melchizedekian priesthood gets lost until Jesus tries to get us back on track. So that's a taste of the kind of reflections that I'll be engaging in. I hope some of you find them interesting. Ultimately, they lead to a rather different understanding of Christianity. I did want to, through this example, try and sort of not just, I think the story of Abraham is a great starting point and incredibly important, and I've put loads of bits in about why I think it's so important already. I did want to illustrate sort of what I think I'm doing, where I think I am with this, which is very much in a sense a pragmatic thing. I mean, this is not meant to be a work of profound philosophy, theology, scholarship. It's informed by those, my readings of those, quite a lot of watching of those as well. Watch a lot of YouTube videos from apologetics and biblical scholars and various and atheists as well as reading. I think I probably do more video watching than reading these days. But it's not meant to be an academic study. There are questions that I'm not even trying to address that I think that scholars and archaeologists might want to. I don't actually care if there was an Abraham. I don't care if the story's historically accurate or not. I care about the message that it gives, how that a work of literature can be true or untrue, even though it's all just fiction, right? The psychology in it can be true. What the people do can be true. Now, that's a really important theme to me, because an awful lot of the stuff in the Bible, a lot of stuff about Jesus himself and his life, is stuff that we will never be able to know for sure, because it happened 2,000 or more years ago, and quite often there just isn't enough evidence left, and we don't know where to look for the evidence in many cases to actually categorically know whether something happened or not. But we can look at something and say, what rings true about this? What would this tell us that is a truth, that is still a valid truth, even if the story is fictional. And this idea of Abraham feeling inspired, seeing an opportunity to reject the dead hand of oppressive traditions and to affirm life, to affirm love, to protect his son instead of offering him up, to value his children and his progeny and his children and his children's children. Not to use people, not to treat your son or anyone else as a means to an end, but as an end in himself. This is a fundamental truth. And this, to me, this is the core message of Christianity. 100%. And it's not an exclusively Christian message because, it's there in Abraham if we understand it properly. And I think it's that truth that has made this story so important. It can't be the truth that Abraham was willing to offer up his son because there must be 100,000 fathers who have slaughtered their sons one way or another in sacrifice. I think that'll do for now. It's a pretty good indication of where we're going to be going with these reflections. Thanks for anybody who's actually stayed with me this long, if anyone ever does. I hope you found it interesting, and